Hi, this is David with EV World News, where we talk about electric vehicles, green energy, and the stock markets. I'm here in the studio today with engineer Mike Herzog. How's it going, Mike?
Hey, David, glad to be here again.
Good to see you. Let's see. So today, my first article comes to us from a website called Vox. Now, Vox is a very left-leaning news site. I like to sometimes disclose, we're in the green space. Everything's a little bit slightly left-leaning, okay? At least a little bit. I'm not as left-leaning as some people or at all, but I do like electric vehicles. So I give kind of a different perspective. And sometimes when I look at some of these articles, um, I kind of wonder where they're coming from. But in this particular case, we're discussing Norway. And Norway is kind of always an interesting case to look at because they're the real early adopters. They started doing EVs and started incentivizing the purchase of EVs before I even knew EVs existed. Okay. And so when did Tesla come around? Around 2012?
It's been at least a decade. I think
Yeah.
it's been a minute.
But there was actually electric cars in the United States, all pretty much all out in California, right? Before that,
It was
all the way
a,
back to
it was a
maybe like
novelty. It
99.
was a novelty for a long time. It was always
Yeah,
that's neat. Yeah.
there were some novelty cars, and we're not talking about all the ones that were first made in the 1800s, obviously, but in modern times, this is kind of interesting because
Wow, and
the
Scandinavia is such a buzzword. Like, wow, look at Norway, look at Sweden, look at
look what
uh,
these descendants of
all these
Vikings
other
are doing.
countries in that area, and they say, oh, they're doing such great things. We could do that here. So I'm always
Yeah.
curious about
Now,
these.
I could get my editor maybe to give this guy a horned helmet, out there charging his Tesla. But anyways, so what we've got here, and Vox is saying electric cars are crucial, but not enough to solve climate change. We can't let them crowd out car-free transit options. So I was really kind of expecting this to come back, and they do get into why EVs maybe haven't been a perfect transition or why it's been so widespread. So I use Norway kind of as an example in that US EV adoption rates are about the same as where Norway was 10 years ago. I think around 2013, they were the same as where we're at now in the United States. And so it's kind of interesting to track where they're going. Now, is Norway a smaller country? Yes. Do they have way more oil than the US per capita? Also, yes. They're probably one of the wealthiest countries in the world, and 1/4 of their GDP comes from oil.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that.
Yes. Oh, yeah. They have a huge. Now, what they do is the national oil companies are somewhat nationalized, and they have a sovereign wealth fund that basically accumulates all the money.
Yeah.
Okay. So here's a couple things that they've done to incentivize, and this is much bigger incentives than what the United States has done. So in Europe, and especially they have really high import taxes. Okay, so you bring a car over there, and if it's a $50,000 made in America car, you're paying well over $100,000 for that car to buy it over there. They have just crazy amounts of taxes on imports. And this is where a lot of these countries, how they fund a lot of their projects to do this. Well, Norway is at about a 90% EV adoption rate on new car sales. I always think that's a little deceptive to use that term because we know that in the United States, while California had 20% new car sales of EVs last year,
Mhm.
that doesn't really represent all the cars people own, right? And so it takes some time for that to change. I saw Musk say if we stop selling gas cars entirely now, it'd be at least 2050 before we'd be at
And
90%
that's a
EV adoption.
really important distinction. Anytime we talk about it, it's new car sales versus cars on the road and what
Right.
it is. And those are so easy to confuse and move back and forth between. Yeah, no, very, very different things.
Norway started the whole EV transition 20 years ago. and they started incentivizing it. So last year, with with them being at 90% new car sales, what percentage of the cars on the road do you think are actually EVs? Just
I'm
take a
trying to
wild
read
guess,
that
Mike.
as you're going through.
Oh, I don't have it on the screen,
Okay.
so just take a wild guess.
I'd go 15%. 15%.
15? It's actually a little higher than that. It's 25.
25. Not bad. That's
Yeah.
pretty good. That's
So
pretty
one
good.
out of four cars in Norway is an EV. But you would think, with them having been at about 9% 10 years ago
For that.
on new car sales and 90% today, it would be, in theory, this huge number. And this is why I always tell people too, EVs are coming. It's going to take a long time to transition. Now, I see, did you hear what California is doing with gas stations?
Mm-mm.
They're banning the construction of new gas stations, and I think they're even banning, like, if you have to pull out the tanks to redo it, they won't permit the
Really?
new
Ah,
stuff. It's basically they're trying to make it so that there will be no more gas
like
stations built.
it's tilting it even further. You're changing the infrastructure behind
You're
it.
changing the infrastructure,
Huh.
and I'm not in agreement with that, because currently, if 20% of their people are buying new cars, at most, that is probably a 4% adoption rate so far of cars in
Yeah.
California. So 96% of cars on the road need gas. So let's say we started building building out a new town with all kinds of new subdivisions somewhere way out in the desert. The idea would be that you couldn't put any
Could
gas
not put
stations
in
near them.
gasoline infrastructure.
Yeah. And that would really hurt real estate.
Why it really hurts all economic development.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
So
that's just, I mean, California's growing. Cities are getting bigger. This isn't, a stagnant place. It's not seeing the same numbers as a Texas, or places like that, but it's still, cities grow.
yeah.
Infrastructure, you build hospital, restaurants, roads, schools, gas stations. I mean, that's just part of your growth.
Well, and I'm all for incentives. And so what they've done that's been different than what the US is doing. So in the US, you can get that $7,500 EV tax credit if you qualify and the vehicle qualifies. And then if you live in some places like California or Colorado, there's up to another $5,000 in state incentives if you qualify. Now, the California ones now, I think you have to be really below a certain income threshold. And so that makes it a little more challenging, because those people usually in those income thresholds aren't buying new cars.
Mm-hmm.
But in Norway, they cut out that VAT. So I was talking about how a $50,000 US car costs $100,000. Well, there it would only cost $50,000. And you no longer have to pay for tolls. I don't think you have to pay for parking. There's all these other things that they've done to incentivize people to do this. Now, they're planning on being at 100% electric vehicle after next year. So I think that Norway may be banning gas cars and after new car sales
There's got to
after
be something else
2025.
there that's really driving that. Otherwise, how do you get to 100% with anything? I mean, that's
Right.
just, yeah, you can't.
Well, you'd imagine there's use cases where you still need to have access to a fueled vehicle of some sort. Historically, Norway, now this is though the deal with this article. So Norway has mostly been rural. Half the nation's population resided in the countryside in 1960.
Wow.
So
Even up through the 50s and 60s, like that urbanization had not happened there.
Right.
Wow.
Whereas in the United States, what do we have? Like 80% of people live in cities, or 90% of people live in
that
cities?
transition happened, 20s, 30s, 40s.
Right. It happened a long time ago.
Everywhere around there in that era, that's when that was happening.
So Norway went hard for automobiles back in the 60s. And they embarked on a road building bridges over fjords, boring tunnels through mountains. And what happened was they stopped using public transit. They stopped having trams. They dumped some of their trams in the North Sea. Yeah, Norway has one of the lowest rates of public transportation usage and a higher car ownership rate than Denmark and Sweden. Now, Denmark is really well known as being a bicycle country.
Mhm.
So people really ride bikes there. American approach towards they're way more like the United States than other European countries where they tend to use transit, they use bikes, other things like that. Of course, it's cold in Norway too. I can't, bicycling may not
Bicycle,
be
it's not a year-round
ideal there either.
bicycle.
Um, People are coming from a place where their parents or grandparents. Norwegians identify as coming from the place where their parents or grandparents came from. Many people have a car to return to that place or simply to visit a cabin in the country. Now, here is an interesting image of some of the first electric cars in Norway. This seems like something Ford and GM would do. But this thing here that looks like something your kids might have as an EV at home, for your 3-year-old to drive around in the little electric car in the driveway. This kind of looks like that, doesn't it?
It's a little
It's not
Mr.
much
Bean car.
bigger.
Yeah.
Yeah, so these weren't terribly popular. This was called the Buddy. This isn't even a big SUV right here. That is really small. That's probably smaller than a smart car.
Yeah. That's
But anyways, I can kind of understand that, being from the United States, I guess I find this kind of funny because I look at the enormous vehicles we have here compared to that, and it's kind of hard to comprehend how much smaller they may use.
I mean,
Norwegians
I
own,
think just the gist of this whole thing, I mean, flexibility, right? I mean, you double down or you start to eliminate some of these other things, no matter what industry, no matter what you're looking at. It's just, yeah, it's challenges and what it looks like. And I think there's a reasonableness around this whole thing. Like, well, no, public transit is still an option. Local transit is still an option. You still want to look at these things and where they're at. So completely eliminating, a source of commerce and transport. Well, no, that's probably not a good thing. I think we could all agree on that.
yeah.
But yeah, I mean,
Well,
so regretting moving towards electric vehicles might be a strong stance on that. It was just, would have been nice if we kept our buses and made them electric too, instead
yeah,
of dumping them in the North Sea.
right. The regret is more about the fact that they have vehicles at all, or
Yeah.
cars, as opposed to mass transit. There was a couple of interesting stats. So say that EV subsidies fueled car sales, but Norway's cities want fewer cars. Now, they gave an example in one city in Norway, 67% of households in the lowest income quartile don't own a car. And
67%.
yeah, in one
Wow.
city don't even own a car. But they found the likelihood that a Norwegian household would purchase an EV rose 26% with each additional US equivalent of about $11,000 in
In
annual income. And it kept
bracket.
scaling up quickly. And so you have a lot of people that simply, families that had 2 cars would buy an EV just because the incentives were good enough that
Mhm.
they couldn't see not having an EV as well. And so they've been pretty good about
Yeah, and like that sounds successful, right? That sounds good.
yes, yeah, it's pretty decent. Now they're not like we did the study on Ethiopia where only 2 in 1,000 people own a car, but they're more like the US in terms of overall rates. It's just showing that in the cities, I suspect if you went to New York City, you'd find that there's a pretty high percentage of the population doesn't own a car there
Doesn't
either.
actually own a vehicle, or if even if they own it, like what's daily use of a vehicle, for
You
personal
know,
use in a place
for
like
electric car adoption in New York City, of all cars, it's only like 1%.
that. Really?
It's really low. Yeah, well, there's challenges there. There's people don't have their own parking spaces, and
Yeah, I mean,
that's the big benefit.
there's parking, and that goes back to, if you do own a vehicle, is it when you get out of the city? So it's, my day-to-day driving is covered by public transit, it's covered by walking, it's covered by whatever. So I actually just need the vehicle to head off to the island, go out to the Hamptons or whatever it is.
Well, I think one of the things, I think the upcoming vehicle to grid solutions are going to make it so that you're going to have lots of charging on the street in places like New York City, because you're then going to be rewarded for putting energy back
Yep.
into the system and then recharging at later rates. So I think you're going to see some exciting things as solutions, but those aren't going to happen next year. You
No,
know,
it's going to be a minute. That
it's
was
going
one
to
of
take a
the
long time.
like poster child for looking at alternate ways to fix the grid was, gosh, I think it was in Queens or is it Manhattan, where it was growing, the city was developing, they needed to put in a new electric substation. You know what it is, and they said it was going to be $1 billion to put that thing around here in rural Nebraska. You can get one for about $1 million, but there it was $1 billion. So
What
looking at
city was
it,
this?
started look at those alternates. Can we just reduce rates? Can we put in storage? What if people started putting in solar? It ended up their projections were a little off, so they didn't move forward. But it was a heck of a project. So your comment about, well, once we get this vehicle to grid stuff figured out, like there's real dollars in just the offset of capital purchases and capital
Right.
infrastructure
And
additions.
what city was that again?
It was New York. I think it was like the Queens, Manhattan, something like that substation project, and it was about 8-10 years ago or something. It was a while back, but if they'd finally, had to make a big addition to a dense urban area, and the cost was just, yeah, this could be $1 billion by the time we're done.
Well, New York City could just keep suing people like Trump and use that money to pay for it.
To pay for that, yeah, just go Robin Hood.
They're gonna they can just start using this as their catalyst to sue every real estate developer that's ever built a property there and had a property loan, and they could use that to fund their projects. Anyways, um, let's see. In Norway, they opened their first light rail in 2010. And in 2019, Trondheim overhauled its bus fleet. I just thought this was kind of interesting because it wasn't really where I kind of expected the article to go. I really expected them to be telling us we were going back to gas cars. In reality, it was telling us we need to go back to trams and
We just
buses.
need to get rid of cars. That's
Yeah,
the next
it,
the next.
it was, yeah, like I said, Vox is a left-leaning site, but they're almost out there. I mean, Bill would be in agreement with them. Bill would have everybody get rid of their cars and switch to e-bikes.
Get on
And
a bike and a electric bus. There you go.
yeah, and that's all right. That's all right.
Mhm.
Everybody's entitled to their opinion, right? The one thing I talk about this all the time. I'm really big on incentives. I like how Norway's incentivized things to this point. I'm not real big on mandates. I don't agree with the whole thing like we were talking about in California with banning gas stations, because it almost makes it's like, hey, the people who can't afford an EV, unless they're going to give them free EVs, it's really hard to justify taking away their fuel
Yeah.
source.
I mean, just the reality of that situation. Now, used cars are, well, the price is starting to come down a little bit on just a used car right now.
Yes.
But typically, if I need a vehicle, I need it now. I need to get to my place of work. I need to get my kids to school. I need whatever it is. I mean, $1,000. I mean, $2,000. You can go get a used vehicle, semi-reliable, and like it's fine. It's gas. It's cheap. I'm going to go to the used car lot and get it. But if that all of a sudden doesn't become an option anymore, like what are people going to do? I mean, that's the reality of it in my mind. It's challenging for people.
Now you're aware of how full-size pickup trucks are starting to stack up on dealer lots, right?
I have
Where,
seen
where
I have
yeah,
seen
they're starting to get anywhere from 3 to 6 months of inventory sitting on the lots. Well, there's something that we never talk about in this space, and that is, are you familiar with Section 179 of the IRS tax code? So
Nope.
Section 179 for many years was allowing, if you bought a 6,000 pound or heavier vehicle for your business, you could deduct the entire cost of the vehicle and depreciate it in the first year.
Mhm.
Okay, it's a huge deduction. It's been one of the biggest deductions. Well, for last year, that dropped to 20% to 80%. It was 100%. Okay, and for this year, I think it drops to 60%.
Mhm.
Okay, so the vehicles that people typically, this is one of the reasons you see contractors all the time driving in a brand new pickup truck, is because they'll buy one. They'll drive
they
it
buy it
themselves
and
for a
depreciate
year or
it
two,
immediately.
and then they'll pass it on to an employee.
Mhm.
And so they'll keep each year buying themselves a new, really loaded out truck that might be $100,000. And then you do that. Well, EVs were working the same way. And so I had people contact me asking me at the end of the year last year which EVs they should buy. And I remember like we were discussing Lucid, Tesla, stuff like that, because they were trying to get the biggest deduction they possibly could. And but that deduction was only 80%. And this year it's only
Mhm.
going to be 60%. So while that's still a good deduction, it's not the same. And see, because you get the tax now, if you're taking that, you probably earn too much to get the tax credit. Okay, you might not.
Mhm.
You might be in a case, and especially if you're doing it commercially, you can probably still be eligible for some of the leasing deals, some of the other
Yeah.
incentives. But that's on top of that, then getting the deduction, because it's a different case. But you were able to deduct the vehicle in full the first year, and then in the next year you started taking mileage deductions.
Mhm.
So that changed things up. So my next topic,
What's the reason for that? Are you sure? I mean, because you'd think with, I mean, electric vehicles and the weight and, that's a big, heavy vehicle for even a compact car.
well, so it generally it's limited to SUVs and trucks. And there
Oh,
was also something that the bed of the truck had to be 6 feet long. That's why you
had
see so many of the four-door trucks have 6 foot beds. And it
because
was
it
almost
hit that
specifically
and all of a sudden you qualify for.
right. Then you qualified for that tax break. But that being said, I think that was the standard though in the truck beds for a
Mhm.
while with the four doors, and the legislation was written to specifically
With
fit.
that in mind.
Yeah,
Okay.
because that was kind of the standard. So, because you used to see a lot more pickup trucks that were single cab that had like a 9 foot bed or something.
Mhm.
I don't know what
Mhm.
the size was, but you remember truck beds used to be much
They used to
longer.
be big. You used to be able to haul
Yeah,
stuff. Yeah.
right. And now the bed isn't quite. It's more of a luxury car that happens to have
That happens to have the
something on the back you can haul things in, and that's kind of where things have gone. And I just thought that was you know interesting to see how that space goes on. And
Mhm.
I'd like to thank people. We've had quite a few viewers today watching live, and but I know we've got time constraints, and so
Mhm.
I think we've had a pretty good show today. And I'm going to go ahead and cut it here, folks. If you liked what you saw, please share this with a friend. Please like and subscribe if you haven't previously, and let us know what you might like to see in the future in the comments.